Hi there and welcome to Capital View. The previous session of Parliament, the winter session, was a washout and the government is bringing in key legislation through the route of ordinances. We're asking, is this leading to Ordinance Raj? Also, the government has recast the Planning Commission as Niti Aayog, but is it only going to be old wine in new bottles? Joining us on this issue, Abhishek Manu Singhvi of the Congress, Nalin Kohli of the BJP, Santosh Mehrotra, Professor of Economics at the JNU, and also someone who was formerly a member of the Planning Commission. Thanks everyone very much indeed for being here. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, you're criticizing the government for Ordinance Raj, for bringing ordinances, but what option does the government have if you're not going to allow the House, the Rajya Sabha to function?
Sagarika, these are serious issues. There is a vast difference between tweaking something, mildly changing it, tailoring it to the exigencies of the experience gained, and whole-scale doing new legislation through ordinance. Take the Land Acquisition Act. It was never sought to be brought up in the session. Let me tell you that the past 10 years, from 2004 to 2014, the degree of disruption by the BJP has been the highest ever in independent Indian parliamentary history. We have disrupted this time, and not us really, but all the opposition parties were unanimous in that the Prime Minister ought to have made a statement on a pressing issue of conversion. So there was not a disruption but a requirement for him to come to the House, which he refused to do. If such kind of provocation is given repeatedly, I don't think we can be held responsible. But consider this, the Land Acquisition Act has been fully, unequivocally, after changes suggested by both Mr. Swaraj and Mr. Jetri, was amended by us. Suddenly now, in the guise of saying that 4 or 5 enactments or 10 enactments which have been exempt from it, that time would expire on 31st December, they brought in an ordinance which actually changes the very structure of it. It changes the consent clause, it changes the public purpose clause, it changes the social impact assessment clause, and several other things. I don't want to get legalistic. The point is, I said elsewhere that this is like Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Now, this kind of a major change in the guise of telling the nation and indeed telling the President that we wanted to continue the exemption for those 7-8 laws is subterfuge, is legislation, policy making by stealth.
Why are you bringing major changes through ordinance?
No, there's no question of why. A government may. After all, that is the job of a government, to govern. Let's go one by one. If you want a full structured response, I can reproduce Mr. Jaitley's very eloquently written article. And for every question you've got, there's an answer in that article. And there can be a full program on that. That's not a problem. Let's go back to each one of the principles that Dr. Singhvi is raising. So first of all, he says that Parliament, the BJP disrupted it. Okay. The Congress party recently came out with a whole booklet of alleged U-turns by the BJP. The biggest U-turn has been of the Congress party between what they proposed 6 months ago, before we were in government, and what they are doing now.
Address the issue of the ordinances.
Don't interrupt me. I'll just finish all the points. I recall everything that Dr. Singhvi has said. So therefore, the point being here, the Congress party chose to disrupt the House, the upper house, where they have the numbers. And what was the Trinamool Congress doing it on the Sharda scam? By adding to it, they are only probably showing which side they'd like to be on. Let's go one by one. Whereas when they are saying a statement by the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister thought it fit, he gave a statement. Did they allow the House to function after that? A minister came up with an inappropriate comment. The minister also expressed regret. The Prime Minister also spoke. Whereas if you look at the model of governance we've seen in the preceding 10 years, how many times we heard the voice of the Prime Minister at all? Let's go next about the ordinances.
No, the Prime Minister in fact did not speak on the issue of convergence
on the issue of conversion. And what did Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, as the Parliamentary Affairs Minister, say? Let us have a full-fledged discussion. If you don't wish to have a discussion, and if you don't wish to put your point beyond the disruption of the House, so be it. They are entitled to do it. That may be their strategy. A government that is here to govern, or a government who is sending out a message, we are not going to let it be business as usual. We want to get into the business of delivering what people of India deserve better. So they are doing it. Now, if an ordinance is a route that they deem fit, why not?
This is a political rhetoric I've heard. The land acquisition bill was not even sought to be brought up in this session. Let's be very clear. The disruption which is talked about, I've already told you, statistically recorded that 2004 to 2014 has seen the highest ever by the opposition in post-independent Indian history. This was a rare unanimity amongst mutually opposing parties. The SP and the BSP came together, the Trinamool and the Communists came together because the Prime Minister thought it fit to travel abroad did not come to the House, and when he came to the House, he refused to discuss an important issue like divisive issue for the country, conversion.
That is
Mr.
political
Singhvi, you can't make a habit of disrupting the House. How can a government which is committed to development, as this government is, constantly deal with this kind of disruption? If you're saying ordinances are anti-democratic, well, disruptors are anti-democratic too.
Let me assume that the bill which was brought in and disrupted allegedly, I don't consider it disruption, but assume it to be so, was the insurance one. How does it give them a mandate? Why can't they wait till February to bring in the land acquisition? That was not even brought up. And land acquisition, let me tell you, is even worse by stealth, because the pretext given by the government spokesperson repeatedly, including the article mentioned, is that there are 10 or 8 acts which have to be exempted and the exemption continued. That required a one-line ordinance. The ordinance you've got is completely altering the fundamentals and the basic structure of the act. That's subterfuge for you.
Now, surely Dr. Singhvi doesn't expect the government of India to use the drafting skills of the Congress party for the way they would like to see the ordinances to come through. After all, I don't think I recall throughout the independent India's history any government asking the opposition parties to draft how they would like to see their legislative business done. Number two, on the Land Acquisition Act, what Dr. Singhvi is failing to probably highlight on this program is the fact that there have been consultations, there have been views rather vocally through the media also, other mechanisms that exist by chief ministers who are of the Congress-ruled states. And if the Congress party should like to proceed on a route by getting those chief ministers of their own parties ruling various states not to move down this route, let them judge in retrospect. Where are the impacts going to be?
He says the chief minister of the Congress were asking for the change. I am amazed, because if apocryphal and anecdotal accounts of chief ministers asking for this are going to govern parliamentary legislation, I hope in this country we are not having chief ministers of states deciding parliamentary legislation and to boot approving the ordinance route. Parliament doesn't discuss it. Parliamentary parties are not brought into confidence.
How is Parliament going to discuss it if you don't let Parliament function?
And you don't go to Parliament at all.
But if you don't let Parliament function,
May I add
how
a
is
sentence
Parliament
too?
going to discuss
No, but that's a fair point.
As Mr. Jaitley says, we
Sagarika,
have
That's
to
one point.
balance
You are
development with justice.
Sagarika,
Dr. Singhvi.
Sagarika, you have had 7 months of this government. You've had 3 sessions in 7 months, not 2. And in 3 sessions, you've had disruption in the last 10 days of December session. They have no time to do any enactment for the 3 sessions except the last 10 days, only the last 10 days. They passed 8 ordinances in 7 months. I mean, what are you saying that we are always
just
disrupting?
two
Let me get you to respond and then we'll get in, Santosh.
Sure.
Very quickly.
2 sentences. I think Dr. Singhvi, perhaps, and it will lead on to the next part of your discussion, just told of a mindset. The mindset being the center will govern over the states, which is reversed to probably a mindset that Prime Minister Modi and his government are trying to bring in, which is the Team India concept, which we put out in our manifesto of involving the states.
There are 8 ordinances: insurance FDI, ordinance for coal auction, regularizing e-rickshaw, amending land acquisition, speedier arbitration, easing visa for NRI, mineral royalties in tribal areas. Now, Rajiv Dhawan has called this constitutional terrorism. Do you believe that all these ordinances are actually subverting democracy, parliamentary democracy?
This cannot carry on. It is a situation which will need to change very quickly, because suppose a joint session of the two houses is brought about, and there too it doesn't get passed, because apparently my understanding of the constitution is that it's only when a bill is defeated that you can actually bring it.
Sure.
But you know, if you don't even bring it,
a joint session.
A joint session. So now suppose a joint session is called and disruption then prevents the law being passed even in the joint session. How will this situation be handled is someone who, as an outsider, is asking myself, and I don't know what the answer is.
But I think the constitutional provision, I think, is that if 6 months are allowed to lapse, then in fact the government can simply push through the ordinance even in the joint session. Is that right, Mr. Singhvi? Or are you going to even disrupt the joint session if that is called?
Professor Mehrotra is raising a very important question, and let me answer that partially. Just consider, you have changed the law. There are 3 conditions. This ordinance which changes the law will lapse if it is not passed as an act of parliament within 6 weeks of parliament convening in February. all the actions you take now, acquisition or otherwise, will then have to be reversed after 6 weeks. Secondly, there is no question of a joint session unless there is a defeat. So it has to be not disrupted or detained or delayed, there has to be rejected by the Rajya Sabha. The third condition is that if it is not rejected, 6 months must elapse during which the Rajya Sabha does not pass it to enable a joint session to be called. Now consider the complete chaos you are creating only on your ego trip, only on your so-called showing governance.
What do you want the government to do?
Now and going to reverse a whole series of equities created between now and February. Well, we'd like the Prime Minister to have whispered about the amendments of the Land Acquisition Act in the June session, in the July session and in the December session, the first 3 quarters of it. And secondly, we'd like the Prime Minister to bring it in February. Will heavens fall, Sagarika, if it is brought in Parliament 2 months later?
Why is the Land Acquisition Act being brought
why alone
in
the Land
now?
Acquisition Act?
Because there are substantive changes that have been made.
Why substance of changes? There is a massive substance of change in the Insurance Act. There's a massive substance of change in the e-rickshaw Act in terms of bringing e-rickshaws in the transport thing. So I think there are substantive changes in every ordinance. They are not brought in for minuscule issues. Ordinances are, after all, brought in for something that when the government couldn't do, and it's of urgency. So therefore you can't single out, because probably Dr. Singhvi may not like to be on the side opposing the others. He may be trying to build a case on a single ordinance. The second point is, what would you like the government to do? Certainly you would not expect us to follow the Congress model, which is, A, the Prime Minister did not speak. Here the Prime Minister does speak rather eloquently very often, if you may say so. So I think that's a model that doesn't compare. And the second part to it is, why do we start with this cynicism and fear that there is going to be chaos, mayhem, etc.? The government also has experienced people with tenures in Parliament that are as extended as Dr. Singhvi's, if not more, who understand what will be the parliamentary step forward. It can't be only based on how the Congress party would perhaps like to see chaos, as the government would like to see no chaos at all.
But the fact is that the opposition says unless the Prime Minister reaches out to them, speaks on conversion, speaks on these issues, they are not going to allow the House to function. So therefore we're looking at a deadlock. But let me just bring in...
No, the answer to that is you can only reach out to those who wish to acknowledge someone reaching out to them. You are basically putting the entire onus on the government and saying that they didn't reach out.
Should the Prime Minister reach out?
So let me give an example.
Should the Prime Minister reach out,
did the Prime Minister not reach out with a statement on an unfortunate comment by a minister who first regretted it, spoke in the Prime Minister spoke in the Lok Sabha, also in the Rajya Sabha. Now, if the Congress party would like a Prime Minister to constantly only reach out to them rather than govern the country, that I'm afraid is a model that the government may not want to consider.
The government may not want to consider. Let me just bring in Santosh in here and raise the point about the larger governance implications. The fact is, with so many ordinances, as Mr. Singhvi is pointing out, they require to be freshly upheld because they can lapse. Now, the fact is, are investors going to have confidence that all these laws are being brought in by ordinance?
Investors naturally look for stability. This is worldwide, whether it is foreign investors or domestic ones. Now, if ordinance rule means that there will be the uncertainty whether it's going to be renewed, not renewed, whether it's going to be passed, not passed as legislation, then your question is a legitimate one. It is a question that would probably arise in the minds of investors, both Indian as well as foreign.
That's an issue, isn't it, Mr. Nalin Kohli? The fact is that courts, incensed by corruption, have cancelled coal block allocations, have cancelled telecom licenses, and investors are wary. Now, on top of this, you're having only ordinances that are coming.
So
and these are not being passed by Parliament.
There are two parts
so
to
how
your
confident
question.
will industry be?
Two parts to the question. One is, the courts cancelled for what were perceived to be bad examples of governance and in some cases blatant corruption. Now, those are examples that happened. And that's why, perhaps, we have to also acknowledge that post that there was a change of government, the people also acknowledged it. Now, that's part of history. Let's come to the current. In the last 6 or 7 months that the government has been there, the Prime Minister, if I may give an example, having travelled internationally, having had so many meetings, there is a lot of talk, there are commitments coming in terms of investments that will pour in. Now, that was even much before than the ordinances took place. There is an expression of interest in looking at India. There is a confidence of looking at India. Now, if the change of government can bring about that, why are we believing that the actions of the government are going to lead to the detriment of that?
Disruptions are only on extreme provocation. They are far lesser in quality and quantity than what we have seen during BJP opposition. And I can tell you that every attempt is made to avoid the least disruption. Parliament.
That in terms of the government and the opposition, you are looking at a 7-month period and comparing it with a 10. And I thank Dr. Singhvi. I thank Dr. Singhvi for pointing out that in grave provocation, as the winter session was there, which led to the JPC on the 2G scam.
Right, all right.
So therefore, there are grave
that.
situations where, of course, it took place.
But you're both saying that there's no reason for doomsday scenarios. That there can be a guarantee that Parliament will function, and there can be a guarantee also that the Prime Minister will reach out. Let's take a short break on this segment. When we come back, we'll talk about the newly constituted Niti Aayog, the former Planning Commission. Is it simply old wine in new bottles? After the break. Welcome back to Capital View. In the previous segment, we spoke about whether we are heading towards an Ordinance Raj. In this segment, let's focus on the Niti Aayog, or the newly constituted body which has replaced the Planning Commission. Is it going to be simply old wine in new bottles? Mr. Abhishek, Manu, Singhvi, you've said this is dismantling of the Nehruvian legacy, but isn't this an important change in keeping with the times? After all, we don't need Nehruvian legacy when we are in a liberalized economy, and reform of the Planning Commission is something that has been talked about for a decade.
We are totally supportive of constructive, meaningful reform. In fact, many committees in the Congress regimes by Congress have suggested reform of the Planning Commission. We are certainly not against that. But I said, A, if it is clearly motivated by an anti-Nehruvian or an anti-Congress stance, then the original cause and motivation is wrong. And the second thing I said was that that appears to be so because a lot of cosmetic, a lot of symbolic changes are being made, and perhaps the result opposite of what is professed is sought to be achieved. For example, this issue about state decentralization. To me, many of the models I have read, and there's not full clarity yet about what Mr. Modi proposes, appear to suggest that there is over-centralization of power in the center.
What's the substantive change?
Well, I think the very first is the fact that chief ministers and or lieutenant governors of union territories are members of a governing council. There's a difference in approach. Second is, I think the name itself sends out the message of what it hopes to be. A national institution for transforming India, which is consultative. That's in line with the thinking that the BJP has spoken about consistently in terms of cooperative federalism, not a top-down, look-down.
Okay, Santosh Mehrotra, which way do you think the government is leaning? Simply a rhetorical overthrow of Nehruvianism, or is it going to be a body that is much more engaged in building capacity in the states, not being the big brother with the states, dealing with the states on an equal footing, being a development network for the states? Which way is the government leaning here?
It's difficult to say today because the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. However, having said that, the one big change is, as Nalin rightly said, is in the governance structure of the Niti Aayog, which is that the chief ministers were earlier not on board in the way that they have been put on board, and they are to become, in a sense, stakeholders. And in fact, the central government could possibly hold them to account.
As a former member of the Planning Commission, as someone who was associated with the Planning Commission, you were a member of the research body of the Planning Commission. Is it just going to be a think tank?
Well, it could be a very powerful think tank because in some ways, the previous Planning Commission...
Because it won't have power to allocate funds.
That in some ways doesn't matter so much. It may, after all, it will still be part of the central government. And the chairperson of the Planning Commission will be the PM and, of the Niti Aayog will be the PM. And if the funding allocation is taking place from the Ministry of Finance, he's the chair of the Council of Ministers as well.
Right.
So the point is that it's perfectly possible for, if the objective is, for instance, to reward good behavior with finances, that can be arranged. But the most important change that has come about or is likely to come about is the fact that they become stakeholders, and they should in some ways, by they I mean the states, become stakeholders and could be held or should be held accountable.
The states have always felt that the Planning Commission is the big brother. They've resented the power of the Planning Commission. Abhishek, Manu, Singhvi, in your tenure, the Planning Commission was known to have spent 35 lakhs to renovate 2 office toilets, and also was notorious for that poverty line figure of rupees 29 per day constituting poor people. No. Do you accept that there is a need to create a body that deals equitably with the states?
Give me my 2 minutes because there's a lot of things here which arise. First of all, I think it's very unfair to judge an institution as old as the Planning Commission by this one event of toilets. I think any aberration is criticizable, it is criticized. That's certainly not the way to judge it. And poverty line has supporters and opposers. At a certain level, in a certain way, by certain parameters, they have judged the poverty line. I don't think that's the be-all and end-all of this very old institution. But let me just be a little more analytical for a moment. I mean, there is a great amount of oratory and a great amount of acronym invention by this Prime Minister and the BJP. Niti is new, the states are on board, stakeholders are nice words, cooperative federalism is an even nicer phrase. But just equal to equal, chart to chart, Sagarika, the old Planning Commission had also the Prime Minister as chairman. The Planning Commission had the additional power, the huge important power of allocation. It doesn't have it now. The Finance Commission was there earlier, it is there now, so it will continue to perform its constitutional functions. Therefore, this big important power of allocation will go from the Planning Commission largely to the Finance Ministry and to the executive government, which will of course make the Niti Aayog a much weaker version of the Planning Commission.
Is it likely to be just a think tank concerned with menu and venue?
First,
because it doesn't have the power, as Mr. Singhvi is pointing out, to make any fund allocation.
First of all, think tanks are not necessarily bad. If you look at the example of the United States, there are foundations and think tanks that do phenomenal amount of work that contribute to the United States being a superpower that it is. We do not, unfortunately, have that kind of a framework. And if an institution can come up at a national level, which is of benefit to the whole country, across the political spectrum, wonderful. My last point is in terms of approach. The approach is different. If you would note the statement that came out, poverty alleviation has been the focus for several decades. The government under Prime Minister Modi is saying poverty elimination as a goal. There's a substantive change in the approach of how you go, which means and the government as an enabler to achieve a goal rather than just being only the provider.
It is an Aayog which is going to be determined by the role of the private sector and private investment. Then what role can it possibly play in determining priorities for states? What role do you see this body playing if the private sector is in any case going to steer the economy?
One of the things which is unfortunate about the erstwhile Planning Commission was that it didn't play very effectively the role of a think tank. One role that does need to play, and it would be brilliant if it actually, the new Niti Aayog does manage to play this role.
A national think tank.
A national think tank in the following sense. Let me explain what I'm saying. You know, there are excellent things which are going on in every sector in many states, but they are not being replicated across the country. I'll give you just one example. Gujarat was a great success story in respect of agriculture, so was Andhra Pradesh. Question arises, why were the good practices from those two states for agriculture not replicated in the rest of the country?
So this think tank
Yes.
would encourage other states to learn from each other?
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
A role of intellectual persuasion, which in a sense the previous Planning Commission
states to learn from each other.
And
but
also
it means having the capacity to dialogue with the states.
Of course.
A very high level of dialogue capacity
which is
with
why
the states.
Having the chief ministers there and then having the regional councils there is an excellent instrument for making this consultation a continuous process.
Mr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, this body recognizes the primacy of the states. It recognizes the fact that states are the engines of development. After all, Mr. Modi himself is a former chief minister, and therefore this is precisely the kind of body you need to put the states center stage.
You have an irony here. Let us assume that it will do all the things which you just heard. It will consult and have innovative ideas. It will actually end up making paper recommendations. It will not have any power because it is not going to make plan allocation. So in that sense, this body is a very weak third, fourth cousin of the original Planning Commission.
Okay, it's a weak advisory body.
Where does the power go?
Well, Doctor,
it doesn't go to the Finance Commission because it is already a constitutional body. It goes to the executive government. So the executive government has taken back the power.
But perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the executive governments must have the power.
One more point, Sagarika. Sagarika, it's going to be a moot question where the chief ministers, who are extremely experienced and somewhat hard-boiled political eggs, are going to be able to function in a give and take exchange model with a academic economist who is going to be heading it, who is going to be virtually the day-to-day manager, the vice chairman. The Prime Minister is not going to have much time.
Right, it's going to be an academic who's going to head it. Is he going to be able to dialogue with the states?
I do not recall.
Don't you need a politician really at the helm?
Yes, well, I do not recall Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia being
All right.
exactly
He was
what
also
you
an
may call a
academic.
frontline political person who may
Right.
have run a state. And we saw him for a period, nor do I recall actually Dr. Manmohan Singh prior to his being
Right.
the finance
No,
minister.
now the states are on the
So
board.
therefore, 1 minute, sir.
Now the states are on
Sir,
board.
So therefore being, I think Dr. Singhvi is consistently focusing on one aspect, which is financial allocation as being the power. And I
Right.
think that itself also has an ill with it, which means, which was a common complaint across the spectrum through the years, that looking down, talking to the states, rather
Was the
than
problem.
talking with the states,
And this
had
is
been
going
the problem
to
of the
ensure
erstwhile
an
institution.
equality with the states. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed to all my panelists for joining me. That's it on Capital View for this edition. Join us again next week. Thanks for watching.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.